Hello students, I'd like to talk about a fearful disease that swept through Europe in the later Middle Ages. It had several generational runs throughout Europe, each one less deadly because the humans started to adapt, and the ones that ended up surviving it ended up building up an immunity and then having children that were immune. But the first couple waves of the Black Death that went through Europe was very deadly. Just in Europe alone, the bubonic plague is estimated somewhere around 75 million dead, about a third of Europe dead from this disease. It kills, even today, untreated patients within 3 to 7 days. We do, with modern medicine today, antibiotics, if you catch the disease in time, if the doctor is smart enough, and we will talk about symptoms here in a second. If the doctor is smart enough and they catch on to it right away, they will be able to give you antibiotics, and you will be able to make a full recovery if the disease does not progress to the necrosis stage. And what necrosis is your skin dying, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So let's go ahead and talk about the bubonic plague. I have a primary source account to start us off. It says they died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo de Turo, buried my 5 children with my own hands. So many died that all believed it was the end of the world. So this poor fella lost 5 children and had to bury them, which obviously would be very awful. It's been said that one of the worst things that someone would have to do is to bury a child. This pandemic killed over 1/3 of Europe's population. Oh, here we go. Sorry. 75 million overall, 34 million in Europe. All right, so we've got 34 million people in Europe, 75 million people worldwide. And really, it's basically these numbers are just for Asia and Europe. Can we talk about the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic? An epidemic is an outbreak of infectious disease. A pandemic is an epidemic that spreads worldwide or across a large region. So all pandemics started off as epidemics, but not all epidemics become pandemics. So if I can think of an example, it's kind of creepy looking at that skeleton holding the earth there. Anyway, okay, so if I can give you an example, let's just say that we have, I don't know, 100 kids absent from school because of a stomach virus. That would be considered an epidemic. However, if a third of the kids across America were absent because of a stomach virus, then you're looking at something that would be known as a pandemic. A pandemic today could be classified as the AIDS virus, the acquired immune deficiency syndrome virus that started in Africa. Was a big problem here in the United States until education helped to slow down the virus itself. The effects of the plague, well, first of all, clearly it had a drastic effect on Europe's population. Imagine a third of America, being, dying and not being around. You obviously would be affected. You'd lose family members. Even if you think about Dorseyville, just get rid of a whole grade level. Imagine the entire 8th grade gone or the entire sixth grade gone. It would be noticeable. Dealt a severe blow to the Catholic Church. People became cynical about prayer and healing because no matter how much these people prayed, they still got sick and died. There was also persecution of minority groups such as Jews, lepers, and people with random skin diseases because this disease started off as lesions on your skin, and so people that had leprosy or other skin diseases like psoriasis or eczema were often considered carriers of the disease. And the reason why Jews were actually persecuted, and poor Jewish people pretty much get it all throughout history as far as being persecuted against. But in this case, many Jews did not get the disease, and there was a specific reason why. And it wasn't because they, were spreading it themselves. It was because of cleanliness and hygiene rules, and also isolation of Jewish settlements. It also caused a mood of morbidity among Europeans. People were uncertain about daily survival and lived in the moment, sort of like Martin McFeary. People lived in the present. They didn't save for the future. They didn't think about tomorrow because you could get sick with this disease and be dead within 3 to 7 days. Why is it called the Black Death? The official name is Yersinia or Yersis, but the disease is nicknamed the Bubonic Plague and also the Black Death. And what it is, the reason why it's called the Black Death is because of the striking symptom of the disease in which the sufferer's skin would blacken due to subdermal hemorrhaging. So let's break down those three words there. Sub means under, dermal has to do with skin, and hemorrhaging has to do with bleeding. So if I break that down, it's under skin bleeding. And as you can see in the picture, you can see these lumps on these people, and so they'd be filled with dead blood, so you'd be like purplish, blackish lumps on the person's body, and eventually turning black as the blood died. Researchers believe that the bubonic plague came from Asia, most likely China, and came across the Silk Road, and was first exposed to Europe at a trading port in Sicily, the island that's right off the coast of Italy there, and then it ended up progressing from ports to trade routes along the major cities throughout Europe. As you can see, 1347 is the brownish area. You can see it just affects Asia Minor, Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and the southern part of France there, a little place called Marseille. But then you can see that in the mid 1348s, the pinkish, orangish pinkish area there, you can see how it has spread through Europe, and then each wave throughout. If you look at the gray area where it says minor outbreak, you can see Eastern European communities. Some of them were spared, and this is where a majority of the Jewish people lived, and they were living in isolated communities. They didn't have a lot of contact with Christian Europe, and this is why a majority of them were spared the disease. Europe was ripe for a plague. There was widespread drought and famine in Europe, and you know what malnutrition leads to from health class. It leads to weakened health and a weakened immune system. And then also, we know there's a lack of general hygiene. Folks, there's still sewage gutters flowing in Europe during this time period in the early 1300s. So, you've got like animal carcasses, you've got number one, you've got number two, you've got garbage, you've got wastewater, all just flowing in these gutters along the streets in Europe. And so imagine the smell, imagine the bugs, imagine the rodents that are drawn to the cities. Very unclean, unsanitary conditions. Italian settlers left a city called Caffa on the Crimean Peninsula. And if you locate the Black Sea there, just look at the northern quadrant right around 12 o'clock. You can see that peninsula that sticks out into the Black Sea. That's known as the Crimean Peninsula. This is where most researchers believe that the bubonic plague actually got on, infected people and infected rats got on the ships at a port city called Caffa. Once they had reached Sicily, many of the sailors on board were dead and dying, and some of these ships ran aground and were looted. They actually were called ghost ships, and so these sailors were in bad shape, and all along the Italian and Sicilian coastline, these ships ran aground, and of course the people in the village, the coastline communities looted the ships, and the infected rats and the disease came on with them. This is a microscopic view of the bugger that caused over 75 million deaths. This is known as Yersinia pestis, named after the person who discovered the disease. His name was Alexander Yersin. He discovered it in 1894. Well, not really discovered the disease, but discovered what caused it. He was a French scientist that discovered this bacteria, and the bacteria is named after him, Alexander Yersin, a French scientist. So fleas became infected with this bacteria, and the bacteria is beautiful in the nature how it survives. Not beautiful because it kills people, but it's just interesting how evolution works within an organism like this. That the bacteria actually multiplies in the fleas, a rat flea's digestive tract, and it blocks the flea's stomach. And so it makes it extremely hungry, and because it's hungry, it becomes extremely aggressive. So the fleas keep biting and searching for new hosts all along the way, infecting other rodents and other fleas then, until the flea ends up starving to death. And then the infected fleas end up traveling on the backs of rats, which are drawn to the unsanitary conditions in European city. So this is really what happens. The flea is the carrier of the disease. The rats carry the flea. So many people are mistaken by thinking that the rats are the ones that caused the bubonic plague. Well, technically they're the carrier of the disease, but it was the fleas on the backs of the rats that would bite human beings and end up causing the bubonic plague. And then the human beings it was a communicable disease, so the human beings ended up giving it to each other then too. So a flea bite could cause it, but then also somebody sneezing in your face could cause it as well. The flea ends up regurgitating, which is kind of like throwing up the infected blood back into the victim. So what happens is a flea bites an infected rat, right? Let's say this whole thing starts in a flea. It bites a rat. It infects it. The rat runs hundreds of miles throughout Europe or crosses a ship or whatever. All the while, the flea is multiplying on the rat's back, and it's and all these little fleas are biting the rat and they're getting infected as well. Then eventually they jump to a human being, they bite the human being, and then it continues on. There are other carriers of the bubonic plague other than rats. Fleas can infect mice, squirrels, cats, dogs, prairie dogs, and my favorite word to say, chipmunks. Then this virus does something, again, sinisterly beautiful inside the human body. The bacteria then becomes present in humans' bodily fluids, and the disease actually causes flu-like symptoms like sneezing, coughing, and vomiting. And so it becomes highly contagious if it's in your body fluid and you're sneezing in somebody's face, you're coughing, or you throw up and somebody, gets near it or, cleans it up or whatever. We had a bacteriologist come in and speak to a class about 5 years ago, and he was talking about how your skin is such a good layer of defense against infection. As long as you don't touch your mouth, your nose, or your eyes, your skin will keep pretty much everything out. So someone that has a really bad stomach flu could vomit all over your desk. You could come in and you could finger paint. I know this is being gross. You could finger paint in the vomit, get it all over your hands, and as long as you don't touch your eyes, your mouth, or your nose, and you go to the bathroom and you wash your hands thoroughly, it is a very strong chance that your skin, unless you have a small cut, your skin will protect yourself from that virus. One of the interesting things that during the bubonic plague and during the Middle Ages, armies laying siege to cities would catapult infected bodies of either dead or dying people over the walls to spread the disease. And this is how many historians think that the disease got into Kaffa and then out into Europe. If you take your fingers and you push both sides of your neck, you'll feel these little egg-shaped kind of nodules. Those are called your lymph nodes. You have them in your neck. You have them in your armpits, and you have them in your groin area on the inside of your leg. And this is the first sign of bubonic plague. You start to feel painful lymph node swelling. Anytime you have an infection, your lymph nodes start to swell a little bit. Even if you have like a fever or you have some type of sinus infection, your lymph nodes, that's the body's first line of defense, that they start to swell and get a little bit sensitive to the touch. Then here's the difference between a normal cold and the bubonic plague is that the skin and the underlying tissue starts to get covered in dark oozing blotches, and what those are is those are the buboes that cause or that are caused by this disease, the bubonic plague. Then finally, fever, headaches, nausea, vomiting, and coughing up blood. There are 3 versions of this plague. There's the bubonic plague, which the buboes appear in the skin. It's about a 50 to 75% mortality rate. And there's the septicemic plague, which is in your blood, and then a pneumonic plague, which is in your lungs, and that one's highly contagious because of coughing and sneezing. The septicemic and pneumonic plague are both 100% fatal if not treated at the hospital in the first 24 hours, even today. So here are the run of the symptoms for the bubonic plague. You'd first start off with lymph node pain, then red and blotchy skin that ends up turning purple, then black, heavy breathing, nausea, joint pain, high fever, vomiting, bloody sputum, which is like phlegm, bloody vomiting, urination of blood, aching of limbs, and terrible pain caused by the actual decomposition of the person's skin while they are still alive. This is not something you want to die from. It is a long, drawn-out disease. It takes 3 to 7 days for your body to finally succumb to the illness. There were some good effects of the plague, and I have it in quotes here because good for the people that were left. Because for the survivors, there was more demand for their work and more farmland was available. And this is one of the major causes for the end of feudalism. It had to end because landlords started competing each other by offering wages and freedoms to the peasants to work the land, because the peasants needed the nobles. And now it's the other way around. The nobles need the peasants, because if you have farmland and it sits barren, if nothing's being grown there, you can't make any money. You need peasants to farm it. And so a third of your peasants are dead and gone, in some cases more. You need to hire, you need to be able to attract more peasants to your land and also keep the peasants that are there. And so they started to get paid. Also, other jobs that, serfs and peasants normally would fulfill, there was a demand for people. And so it ended up starting this foundation of this style of economic system we have here in the United States known as capitalism or free markets. A bad thing about the plague, other than a bunch of people dying, is that there were some persecutions. The plague infected few European Jews, which caused real suspicions. They were thought to be poisoning wells and to be, trying to kill Christians because they weren't of the Christian faith. But the real reason why Jews were not affected by the bubonic plague was due to rabbinical laws, which had laws for cleanliness and cleaning your body, and also the isolation of Jewish settlements. The Christians living in Europe had not been very nice to the Jews up to this point, and so many of the Jews were living in their own settlements with little to no contact with the Christian Europeans. This resulted in a further eastward movement of Jews into Poland and eastern Russia, and also people with skin diseases such as acne, psoriasis, eczema, and leprosy were targeted and scapegoated because, as I said before, they were thought to be carriers of the disease. So it's bad enough that you're vomiting blood, you're urinating blood, you're achy, you have a fever, Then this cat shows up, and this is what the doctors wore in the Middle Ages. Pretty creepy looking. The hat was wide-brimmed and black, and identified him as a doctor. The mask, they thought that birds were spreading the disease at first, and so they were doing this to keep the disease away from the doctors. And also then they filled that beak filled with strong-smelling herbs and flowers because when a body's decomposing, it smells really badly. So a bubonic plague victim would really stink, like a rotting animal that you could smell in the woods, that something was hit and killed or something died in the woods, or something died on the road. That's the smell that people would be giving off due to the disease. The overcoat was to minimize skin exposure. There was a wooden cane to examine or move the patient so the doctor didn't have to touch him or her. And then the last thing, what breeches are, is they're sort of hip waders, that a trout fisherman would wear. And they were made of leather in this case to protect the groin area from infection, because what they realized is this disease started in the neck, armpits, and groin area. And we know now that that's where your lymph nodes are, and that's the first sign of the disease. However, back then they had no idea about lymph nodes and microscopic bacteria. Though some circles this is discredited, I'd say maybe historians are about 50-50 on this, but many people think that this English nursery rhyme is about the plague. And I know that many of you have done this when you were kids. You hold hands and sing Ring Around the Rosie, Pocket Full of Posies, Ashes, Ashes, We All Fall Down. My kids love this. They still do it, even though they're 4 and 5, and sometimes I'll even catch my 10-year-old doing it with them. But what some people feel is that this is a poem about the Black Death. Ring Around the Rosie would be the red bubole that you get before it starts to turn black. Pocket Full of Posies would be the people that were suffering from the bubonic plague would often shove their pockets filled with flowers so they would not have to smell their decomposing skin, and so the people would not have to smell them. Ashes, Ashes could be one of two things. Some people think it's achoo, achoo was the original version of this, which meant that you would sneeze. Some people believe it was the burning of bodies that died from the plague. And then We All Fall Down. Clearly, the connection there is that everyone is dead. And if you think about it, think about what the kids do. They go around in a circle, then they simulate death. What a morbid thing for our children of America to do. Basically, this poem is saying, you get a bad rash, you smell really bad, you sneeze, and you die. And then what do the children of America do? They fall down backwards and giggle. They are making fun of a pandemic that killed a total of 75 million people. Way to go, America. These people are called flagellants. Do not confuse them with flatulence, which is something that the men will do once in a while, hopefully when the women aren't around. But the flagellants are people that thought that the plague was God's wrath and that it was punishing sinners. And so oftentimes these people would beat themselves with whips to take away the sin and to punish themselves so they didn't get the plague. And so these guys are holding like little whips and they're whipping themselves in the back. I think in the one of the Dan Brown books, I want to say it might be Da Vinci Code. One of the bad guys is a flagellant. He beats himself with a whip. I think it's Da Vinci Code. All right, the plague is still around. Not so much in the United States. About 10 to 20 people contracted here in the United States yearly. Nowhere in Pennsylvania. It's in the American Southwest. New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado are the most recent cases that have been reported. It is treated with antibiotics as long as you get to the hospital in time. The bacteriologist that came to our school to talk to us said that if somebody was showing bubonic plague symptoms in a Pittsburgh hospital, they probably would ask if you've been traveling anywhere outside the country or if you've traveled to the American Southwest. That would be one of the first questions that they would ask in trying to decipher if you had the plague. But the main defense is modern hygiene. We have sewage pipes that are enclosed. We take care of our sewage here in the United States. Garbage is not left in the streets normally, and our sanitation systems help to protect us from the bubonic plague. But it is still common in countries that are underdeveloped, like Russia, the Middle East, India, some parts of India, some parts of China, and parts of Brazil. Japan tried to use it as biological warfare in World War II. They dropped some infected fleas of the bubonic plague over top of China, but it didn't work. There were no reported cases of the bubonic plague growing in China during World War II. So look at this poor girl. You can see the bubole that's starting to stretch in her neck area. This is one of the first signs of the bubonic plague. This would be pus-filled. This would be filled with dead blood, dead infected blood. This kid has one on the inside of his leg in the groin area. You can see the buboles there. And I know this is gross, I'm sorry, but what happens is when these buboles rupture, you get necrosis of the skin dies and will not come back. And you can see that the bubonic plague affects not only flat pieces of skin like your arm and your leg, but also then fingertips. I see this often. On modern cases, people end up losing their fingers or their toes. You're going to watch a video about an American man that contracted the bubonic plague, and he ends up he's going to lose his fingers and his toes. People in Europe knew they needed to get rid of the bodies, and so there was a cart that came through the communities each day, and someone would scream to bring out your dead, and people would carry out the dead bodies of relatives and loved ones and put them on the cart. There's a Monty Python little skit that makes fun of that. And trying to make light of a serious topic, this little boy saying, "Hello, Mrs. Krabransky, can Rodney come out and plague?" Get it? Plague. Okay, that's it. That's what I know about the bubonic plague. It's one of the reasons for the decline of feudalism. Thanks for watching.